Welcome back to your first class, and today we'll be talking about when you're given a property and you're being asked if it's an intensive property or if it's an extensive property. And we'll talk about what's the difference of them. It's a very common question that be always first exam, always be there, just probably multiple choice. So first, let's talk about the difference. So for extensive property, it will be related to the amount of something. So just like how much to the what extent do you have this? So for example, mass, right? So let's say I have a glass of water, and on the other hand, I have just a drop of water, right? The mass will be different. And the more amount of this you have, the more mass of this you will have. So that's why it's being called extensive property. And there are more examples of this kind. So another example, size, let's say we always measure the dimension of something, right? And for example, you have a cake. And if you cut the cake in half, the size will shrink also in half for each one of them, right? So it's really, and if you have another cake and you put them together, you're gonna have a larger size. So it's related to how much of this thing you have. And for another one that we'll talk about later, which is heat capacity, which means the amount of heat required to heat something up for 1 degree Celsius. So let's say I'm gonna heat a piece of gold, where it's just a gold foil up for 1 degree C, right? It probably just take, let's say, 1 joule, so very little amount of energy. But on the other hand, if I'm gonna heat up a gold bar, which is definitely gonna take a lot of energy, a lot more energy than just heating up just one piece of gold foil, right? So it's really related to the amount of this thing that's being present. Well, on the other hand, you have intensive property, which means it's not related to the amount of something. And there are lots of examples for this. So, for example, temperature, right? If you have a glass of water and you measure the temperature first, let's say it's 20 degrees C. If you pour out half, which in this case you have less amount of it, but you still have the same temperature, right? So it's not related to the amount of this thing. And another thing, say let's say the physical property we talked last time of melting point. Um, so let's say sometimes you put water in freezer, and then at 0 degrees C, it will turn into ice, right? Or if you take ice block out of the fridge and then start to melt at 0 degrees C. And the same process for this ice cube comparing to the ice on top of lake, right? So it's not related to how much water as of ice cube or all the water in the lake. It's really related to the chemical you're talking about, which is water, right? And another example of color, let's say you have a blue T-shirt. If you rip it in half, they still have the same color, right? The color won't change because that's only related to the matter itself. So this, as I said, this is a very simple question. You will always have this first exam. You will never see it again. So, and the easy rule is if you're being asked, you just think about if we cut this thing in half, is the property still the same? If it's the same, then it's going to be intensive property. So let's do a few examples of this. So let's say is area an intensive property or extensive property? Well, let's think about it. So let's say you have a circle, right? And then you have an area of the circle. If you cut it in half, put half away, you're gonna only have less half the area, right? So it is related to the amount of it. So it's gonna be extensive property. Well, what about concentration? Well, concentration means how much of something you have in a certain amount of volume, a certain amount of liquid, let's say salt water. So you have an amount of salt in a volume, certain volume of water. And if I pour out half, the concentration is still going to be the same, right? It won't taste like less salty if you just pour out half. So this property is the same. So it's going to be intensive property. And what about hardness? So you have a piece of rock, it's pretty hard, right? And if you just cut it in half, the half of it is super hard. It's basically just as hard as it used to be. So this property is the same, so it's intensive property. What about mass? We talked about this before. Mass, weight is all related to how much of this you have, so it's extensive property. And what about boiling point? Similar as melting point, what we talk about, it's really just related to the substance you're talking about. So that's the intensive property of this matter. And I hope this is helping you. Let's see you in the next one.